got Dan with us. Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to, introduce everybody. So my name is Katherine Knight. I'm the VP of Brand and Communications at Launchmetrics. And it's my pleasure to have our next speaker with us, who always comes in with the breaking latest sportswear news, has all the top brands on speed dial. So please welcome or join me in welcoming Daniel-Yaw Miller, the renowned journalist and consultant specializing in all things sports, fashion, and culture. So today I'm going to put him in the hot seat because I know he's used to having others in the hot seat, because I want to get his insights on all things in the future of sportswear, the rapid shifts we're seeing, and how really it's blended into lifestyle culture as we know it, reshaping everything from streetwear to fitness. So Dan, welcome. How are you doing
Thanks
today?
very much for having me. I'm great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Fantastic. Let's start off with some personal news. As I know you announced late December that you were leaving Business of Fashion, where actually you launched their sportswear vertical for a new adventure. And I hear that you just started in your new role. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? Because curious minds want to know.
For sure. So I had such a great run at the business of fashion. I loved it so much. And like you said, I love covering all those areas. But in at the end of December, I stepped away and began a new role just last week at a US-based advisory firm called Upland Workshop, where my title is Vice President Sports and Culture. And at that firm, we advise athletes, including some NBA players and sports organizations about kind of like how they position their businesses and how they can kind of like modernize their approach to media strategy and certain commercial projects, all in and around the world of sport. And I'm bringing my expertise from the world of fashion and sportswear over to that side of things. And then alongside that, I'm also writing my newsletter, Sportsverse, which again is all of my previous reporting, which you can find on Substack.
Amazing. I love it. And that coupled with your legal background as well, fits into a really good, let's say, positioning for all things advisory. So, I mean, you guys are really hearing from an expert here, and we're lucky to have you with us. So I see there's already some congrats in the chat, which I echo that. So congratulations. Um, Jumping into, I suppose, the conversation that we have planned today, I wanted to start off with looking back, from, let's say, late 2023. Feel free to go earlier if you want to do a deep cut. But the sportswear industry has like evolved a lot lately and quite rapidly, blending, performance wear with lifestyle. It's reshaped fashion, it's reshaped fitness, sportswear, streetwear. And so before we jump into specific questions, give me a lay of the land. How are things going? How are things playing out today? How did we get here? How did sportswear break out into the wider consumer reach? We're seeing like brands like Arc'teryx and Solomon, in the streets and not just in the mountains anymore. So like, what is driving this?
Yeah, I mean, I just at the moment I'm rereading Phil Knight's Shoe Dog book.
Ooh.
The Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, and it's just like it strikes me how it's fascinating how like the concept of sportswear and specific clothing that you wear for different sporting activities was so alien to us as a society at one point. And even though like that book, a lot of that book is set in the 60s and 70s, like even up and through the kind of like 2000s, early 2010s, again, like the idea of sports clothing and activewear was so alien. People used to just throw on like their old tattered sweaters and shoes
Yeah,
every
sometimes I still see, so I lived in Paris. I still sometimes see some French people with like Converse and jeans at the gym.
Right, yeah, that kind of thing, or like going out for a run in Converses and
Exactly.
like it was kind of in the 2010s where we really saw that kind of proliferation of brands popping up around specific interests, and at that point, of course, you did have like the big um, general activewear, sportswear players like Nike, Puma, Adidas, but that I'd say that market was relatively stable up until the early 2010s, and then we had this kind of like explosion of upstart brands, like the early roots of those brands coming through. Like that's when the Ons of the world and Hokas of the world started springing up, and then we got to the pandemic where obviously this whole kind of like world of sports was turbocharged because everyone was trying to like get out of their house or work out inside the house if they were stuck inside,
Or be comfortable working from
be
home.
comfortable working from home. And that's when we saw those kind of brands that had been bubbling under the surface really come to a new phase of maturity and start challenging the bigger brands. And again, at that time, we saw the bigger brands like Nike and Adidas, their businesses were almost like turbocharged and boosted because they were in this like dominant position where they could benefit from everyone being at home, everyone shopping online, and all these amazing channels that they had set up ready for direct to consumer sales and distribution. And then after the pandemic, we saw, brands like Nike go through unprecedented times of struggle because of, I mean, so many kind of cultural and commercial factors that I'm sure we'll get into. We
I
also
have
saw
some questions on Nike. Yeah, I can't leave you without asking about it. So,
And we also saw Adidas go through a crisis of its own and then very quickly recover. But as you mentioned, in that period, we've also seen those specialist brands really come to the fore. And I think one of the most interesting kind of waves we've seen recently since kind of like 2021 through to now is the revival that so many specialist brands that were considered like very nerdy, very uncool, only worn by people above a certain age for like technical or practical use. For example, Salomon, Asics, even New Balance, Arc'teryx, all
yeah.
become like at the height of fashion, and that again came like had its roots in
I mean, New Balance started as a dad shoe. That's how
yeah,
it became cool if you think about it. But now it's like
exactly.
actually beyond that.
Yeah, and like the New Balance, one of New Balance's most famous marketing campaigns said like it's their standard dad runner shoe, and the slogan is like worn by dads in Ohio and supermodels in London. But yeah, it's that kind of thing. Like those technical brands really are now at the forefront of what's driving styles and trends in the sportswear industry.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, you said a lot, and like we'll get to that. We'll unpack it. But sportswear has, of course, been turned upside down in the past month. And you mentioned the two major players, Nike and Adidas. So, before we get into that, I guess I want to dive into a bit more of the recent state of affairs for both brands. As they're going to be moving into 2025, not necessarily picking apart the each scenario, but moving forward, how do you think their histories will be defined in the coming months? Because I think they've made a lot of big decisions, strategic decisions that are going to change their trajectory. And so what do you see from these two brands as we move ahead?
I think this is going to be one of the most exciting years we've seen in a long time in sports, in a positive way. I think like previous years were very exciting for full of drama and upheaval, but I think like
Unexpected things you didn't have on your business bingo card.
no, like pure chaos. But I think moving into 2025 and beyond, I think like this is a very exciting time of opportunity for both Adidas and Nike, the category's biggest players. They both had, like we said, like quite a lot of turbulence in their recent history, but both are now both now have like the right building blocks in place. So to take Adidas for an example, this time last year was their new CEO's first month in the role, and he inherited a chaotic situation when Adidas had terminated its Yeezy deal, and fast forward to now, no one would have thought that Adidas would have been able to stage a comeback so quickly, but he did that through a number of things, and like his words when I interviewed him was that it was a combination of luck, timing, and effort. Just the timing in the sense that people all of a sudden were looking for something new to wear, so they gravitated to Sambas and
Yeah,
Gazelles and
they're ready for it.
sneakers. They were ready for it, but at the same time, it was timing because he came in and instantly said, "I can see this is bubbling up. I'm going to ramp up production to the millions by the end of the year." And
Yeah.
so now they're heading to a position where they've had a very successful 2024. I think sales grew around 11% year on year. They added about $1 billion, 1 billion euros in operating profit, and they're back at the level where they were before the Yeezy deal kind of exploded. Um, and they're in a very good and strong position now, both on in terms of their performance wear and their lifestyle wear, in terms of the fashion collections and fashion footwear that they have to dominate and really push Nike throughout the next year, 2 years. And then with Nike, we have a very interesting situation where Elliot Hill, the new CEO, who is a veteran of the company, as most people I'm sure will know, has returned to the company in the wake of maybe the most kind of unprecedented, challenging period in Nike's recent history. And he's brought with him this kind of un unprecedented again wave of optimism. Um,
Yeah. Well,
the
let's talk about that because Nike's comeback, because you wrote about the recent turnaround under Elliott Hill, after losing their core purpose, relying too heavily on few product lines. I mean, they're DTC, direct to consumer, let's say channel hiccups, we'll call it. But you did outline, like you said, that it's super promising. And so what are your thoughts on the future vision? What can the brands learn from Nike's strategic up and downs? What can we expect? And how can those learnings help, brands inform their own strategies?
Yeah, I guess the biggest learning is that you're never too big to, I
Never too
guess,
big to fail.
yeah, never too big to fail. And I mean, in
Exactly.
Nike's case, they kind of are too big to fail because they're literally like $51 billion giant, and they're going to be fine. But you're never too big to run off course, I think is the lesson. And
Yeah.
I think it's also worth remembering that at the time Nike decided it was going to kind of like focus on its own channel, selling through its website, selling through its sneakers app, and kind of move away from certain big wholesale stores. That was a time in the market when literally everyone was doing it, and brands were being applauded for it. But I think Nike was one of the hardest hit brands for doing so because it was also one of the brands that had the biggest cultural touch points in kind of youth culture, city culture, but also sports culture. And to do that, you need to work with specialist stores and retailers because that's where
Well,
consumers.
exactly. I remember I used at one point when they did shift their strategy, I was before I even, was even thinking about it, I had my consumer mindset on. I needed some sneakers for running, and I was like, oh, I'll just go to Foot Locker in Paris and just take a look from all the different brands, like which shoe I like. And I'm like, where are the Nikes? And then
Yeah,
it was like, oh, they're the flagship. And I was like, I have to go to the flagship to try on and compare with shoes that are here. Like, I'm not going to do that. In the end, I didn't, and then excluded it from my, my options. But it's I think the importance of retailers within these categories is super important because people don't necessarily always go to the brand retailers themselves directly to purchase, right? They're going maybe to the stores for an experience, or maybe they do necessarily want only this product, but a lot of times they want to check multiple brands.
right. And when I think back to like when I was younger and before I was in this kind of world, like to me as a shopper and a consumer on the street, you don't make a distinction between um like what store it's what. You go into a shoe store, like whether that's like a multi-brand retailer or like a Nike flagship, and you expect to see like the shoes you want to see. Like if I go into a store and I don't see a certain brand, I'm like, okay, it's not here. Like I'm not gonna seek it out specifically. I'm just gonna pick from what my options are here. So like I think
Exactly.
that's one big learning that other brands can take. You can't neglect the retailers, and that's one big win that Adidas have had. In having its current CEO, Bjorn Gordon, because he's like a really big fan of wholesale and retailers, and he brought over those great relationships that he had with them from his Puma days over into Adidas, and they were able to fill that store space that was vacated by Nike, as did the likes of On, Hoka, Asics, New Balance, and that is one of the biggest learnings I think from the recent last few years.
Yeah, and what is your thoughts on their optimistic vision? What are you most excited to see from Nike then?
I mean, I think
What
we're
makes you feel like this is promising? Although, to be honest, Elliot Hill's experience, I think is going to bring a lot to reboost the brand and energy and internal ambiance.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think on his first day, people were literally crying and as in Nike people in the on the campus, and I think that's a good sign of like the instant kind of morale boost that a leadership change can have. But I mean, I've been really encouraged by the early signs around like how their marketing has shifted of late.
Yeah.
And last year they brought back another veteran called Nicole Hubbard Graham in the role of Chief Marketing Officer, and kind of her first big public piece of work was the "Winning Isn't for Everyone" campaign that rolled out during the Olympics, and that was a super divisive campaign. A lot of people loved it, a lot of people
It
hated
was
it.
powerful no matter what.
Powerful,
Love it
yeah.
or hate it. It was powerful. It
And
had that Nike flair to it.
exactly, and that's what she said to me when I interviewed her. She said that it wasn't designed to be liked by everyone, and like the best kind of marketing is meant to be divisive. It's meant to put some people off. It's meant to get some people excited about the products, and that's really carried through since the start of Elliot Hill's career as Nike CEO. And we saw recently about Air Jordan bringing back one of the original Jordan sneakers, the one that supposedly was banned by the NBA, and their marketing strategy to kind of remove the Jordan Instagram, ban that specific shoe, and hand out like fake fines to people on the Nike campus, all part of this big
I saw
marketing
that,
push.
yeah.
And then again, I think Nike's done a lot of important work in kind of reconnecting and making female Nike consumers feel a bit more important to the brand as well.
Yes.
They've had some really good releases coming out. in kind of like recent weeks and the upcoming weeks as well. So I think on a product side, they're getting back into it and understanding a bit more about like the silhouette that people want. And also on a marketing side, they're being a bit more fearless. They're being a bit more giving people the feeling that the old Nike is back.
Yeah, I love that. And then speaking to Adidas, so you got into it a little bit about how essentially, well, they had their moment and their own, let's say, crises with Yeezy, to just put it out there as a reference, but they quickly recovered. And in fact, over the past year, they've gone from strength to strength. And even our data on 2024 showed that the brand's impact, brand performance grew 43% year on year. And I know I was speaking with you in another conversation, and they overtook Nike for the first time in recent years, like in the rankings. Like you said, Nike's Nike there at the top, but actually Adidas took over that place, which was quite powerful and just demonstrated how quickly they could become in tune with their audience and reactive to, general culture. So what are your thoughts here, and how do you predict the brand moving forward in 2025? And how do you think they're going to, well, what do you think is going to go on with this tit for tat back and forth in the rankings with Nike, given also their strategy?
Yeah, that's why I think this is going to be such an interesting year, just to watch how they kind of make each other better and more competitive.
Oh
But
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the reasons for that kind of shift that you mentioned is how close Adidas has become to sports culture.
Yep.
Again, and it's weird for us to sit here and talk about, sportswear brand straying from sports culture, but I think it's something that both Nike and Adidas have been partly guilty of in the past. It's like you become such a big brand, you're kind of doing sportswear, you're kind of doing gym wear, and you forget that like your origins come from the culture and love and connectivity to sports, and that includes connectivity to athletes in your marketing, working with the best sports teams in the world, and like how you position them alongside your brand. And when Elliot Hill came into Nike, that was one of the first things he said about the business, is that it had strayed too far away from sport and sports culture.
Yeah.
And then so with Adidas, like when Bjorn Gulden, the CEO, came in last January, he's a former footballer, soccer player. He's like a professed, like self-professed sports romantic, and his kind of ambition was to kind of reposition Adidas's athletes, Adidas's teams, and Adidas's reputation as like a performance sportswear player, um, front and center.
I mean, you saw that with their sponsorships, that they kept taking over sponsorships one
Yeah, yeah.
after another.
And and again, that like part of that is all about like bringing closer links between the brand's like cultural side and the sporting side. So, for example, during the Olympics, we saw Noah Lyles win gold wearing a pair of
Yeah.
Adidas Y3 spikes, and Y3 is Adidas's collaboration with Yohji Yamamoto. We saw Adidas getting Wales Bonneter's design kits for the Jamaican national team.
Yeah.
And in the most recent Paris Fashion Week, we saw on the runway Adidas having the likes of Candace Parker, the legendary WNBA player who's now head of their basketball category, and Djibril Cissé, the legendary ex-French footballer, walking in their runway show. So I think that's exactly as a sportswear brand how you infuse the notion of being an elite sports brand working with elite talent alongside your credentials as a fashion player.
Yeah, and just having an impact on culture, being part of those cultural conversations, because sportswear for so many is thinking of the audience, but sports fans, it's part of their lives. You know what I mean? So it just being infused into as many angles as possible, emotionally, I think is what helps, because you're creating those, those emotional links. And so I guess we've discussed the two players. Like I said, we could go into that for much longer detail, but beyond that, I think it's important to recognize too that brands like Hoka, On, I see there's a lot of questions in the audience asking about the opinion of On. New Balance, which we touched on, have started to really make an impact. They're positioning themselves at the forefront. What are driving these, well, the once niche brands, performance brands, to the spotlight? And what do you think is behind their rise? And what other emerging brands should people be paying attention to? Or what maybe mid brands are like there and they're just like on the brink? On was big, but then On became Challengers big and
Yeah.
really pushed it to the next level. So all those questions.
I mean, so I guess to begin with, On, I mean, that's the brand, maybe the brand I've covered the most as a reporter. And I remember going out to their headquarters in Zurich to write a story, and I interviewed the founders in 2020 or 2021, sorry. Um, and even then, like the brand wasn't nearly what it was today.
Mm.
I'm sure if it crossed, it was on the brink of maybe $1 billion in revenue, but on very much on the brink, and now it's closing three. But I mean, I think the story of that brand is fascinating because obviously, like the shoe itself is so unique, and I think that is the kind of core element throughout all of these kind of upstart brands, and all the older brands like New Balance and Salomon that have had a reemergence. It's like the market at one point, if we go back to the COVID and the times before, was flooded with almost purely Nike, Adidas, Puma. And at some point, especially during the pandemic, consumers got a little bored and started to look elsewhere. And I think that was down to the bigger brands maybe resting on their laurels a bit and not refreshing their categories and assortments
Yeah.
and what people saw on the shelves. And all of a sudden, you had stores taking a chance on these like funky running shoes from Switzerland. And I speak to the founder of On, David, one of the co-founders, sorry, David Alleman a lot, and he speaks a lot about the importance of something called VizTech, and that's like the visible technology that you can see on the sneaker. And
Oh
for
yeah.
On, the midsole is made out of a design that was inspired by a rubber garden hose, and it's those small details.
Is that really what it is? I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
that story.
So On has two big innovations. There's the Cloud Tech, which was inspired by like a rubber garden hose, and the second one is a more recent one, which they found from like a glue gun spray for like a Halloween costume, and
Yes.
it's the kind of spray that they use to spray on their like super high performance
Yeah.
$400 running shoes.
I saw that they had a big like rollout during the
Yeah,
Olympics, wasn't it?
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like that's the core element of On's appeal, for example. It's like the commitment to innovation and disruption.
Yeah.
I think was a little lost at some point from Nike and Adidas just because of by nature of their position in the market, they needed to experiment a little less, whereas On was this plucky upstart brand that was set on
Pushing. Yeah.
convincing consumers and especially high performance athletes in the sports of running and trail running, which also had this big boom coincidentally over the last few years. So it was kind of the perfect storm, and that's really what carried Hoka as well. This kind of boom and interest in running, and the aesthetic of running maybe carrying not just in your run but throughout your workday, and people gravitating to these shoes because they might be 20 or 30 or $40 a bit more expensive than Nike or Adidas, but they have performance credentials that mean that if you wear them throughout your day, whether that's for running or for gym or for just being in the office, your body is being protected maybe a little bit more, or you do have that kind of like feeling that you're a bit closer to sport.
Exactly. And somebody actually in the audience, which I think it fits in well with this one, is asking about Saucony, a luxury or legacy brand that's gone through so much of creative change. Disclosure, this person did work with them. But what were your thoughts on on how they've kind of fit into the mix as well?
Yeah, I think Saucony is a great example of a brand that has again come from obscurity. Like I'd put that in the same bracket as Asics and New Balance, like relative obscurity again, like very specific performance product that's now like a contender and very much in the mix with all these big fashion shoe players, and you see them popping up at Paris Fashion Week. You see them doing collaborations. You see runners wearing their stuff. You see fashion kids wearing their stuff, and I think Saucony is a fascinating brand. It's also part of a group called Wolverine Worldwide, and that also owns another like very technical brand that I'm sure you'll know, Catherine, called Merrell.
Oh
And
yeah.
again,
Yeah.
Merrell's another one that like I don't know anyone above maybe my parents' age who wasn't above my parents' age who'd be wearing them a few years ago. But now, like again, it's very much a fashion
Yeah,
shoe.
they were very much in like they're always buried in like the specialty or hiking
Yeah,
area of
hiking.
like a sports store, but a very like old school sports store and not like in the fashion area at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then
But
like
they're excellent.
they're
Yeah.
excellent and they're great shoes, and this is why now designers and brands and consumers are gravitating towards them because you can underscore the value of that product because it's actually a technically robust shoe. And I'd say the same for brands like Mizuno, which again used to be super technical for very specific sports and are now like encroaching on the sportswear fashion market.
Yeah, I feel like almost honestly to know what's coming up next. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball as much as you do, but I almost kind of want to be like, okay, what am I seeing on the trails? What am I seeing in the mountains? What am I seeing like the athletes wear like, in the backwoods
Yeah.
up
I
in
mean,
high altitude, things like this, and like what are the experts wearing? And like that's actually probably gonna bounce into some fashion collaboration at some point and make it
yeah.
mainstream.
Yeah, one like interesting development that I've been writing about over the last couple of years has been the rise of like hyper-specific specialized brands, especially around the idea of women needing specific footwear or it helping
Yes.
in specific sports. So, for example, I've written about a Canadian startup brand that's growing quite quickly called Hetas, and they're based in Vancouver, and that's specifically running performance running footwear built around the body types and I guess running tread of women. And
Well, it's not the same as men. We have hips, so
exactly. And brands for decades, for since the beginning of time have only built sneakers based off um men's feet.
you always have to go to the men's section. Well, not
Exactly.
always,
Yeah.
but oftentimes I had to find my basketball shoes in the men's section
Right.
because that's
Yeah, yeah,
where
yeah.
you get the technical gear.
Yeah, and then speaking of basketball, there's a really great women's only basketball sneaker company in New York called Moolah Kicks, and they're beginning to work with WNBA players and players across the college and high
Love
school
it.
system, growing super quickly, stocked in Dick's Sporting Goods, and I've really enjoyed seeing those brands kind of come up and take market share where which they kind of like deserve to be speaking to almost exclusively.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point is like tapping into specific needs, like the women's needs in terms of sportswear gear, et cetera, even North Face when it comes to mountain gear, so different. And they've developed, a lot of gear just for the women body, which is, it works very differently and it's not the same. So I think that's a huge market that we're going to be seeing as well some growth in. But now I guess I want to shift to sporting events. I know we briefly talked away from the sporting, or we briefly talked about the audiences and the sporting fans. So we're seeing a shift more and more where these sporting events are becoming key moments to attract new audiences. I think one example, standout example that speaks to almost everybody here, even if you're not an American watching the Super Bowl, but the 2023 Super Bowl, that Rihanna moment, right? That Fenty Beauty moment, the pregnancy moment, all of it. Our team of analysts actually ran the data a week after just to see like the impact of this, and it was quite fascinating. They drove over 11.3 million in MIV just for Fenty Beauty alone following this event, which is huge because if you think about Fenty Beauty with the Super Bowl, you wouldn't think it would have driven as many conversations, but alas, there is a big women and female audience watching it. So seeing this growing connection between sports events and beauty, but even beyond that, there's more examples. There's tennis and tennis court coming from challengers. There's Olympics, LVMH sponsorship. I know that was brought up this morning in the conversation with Lucas Solka. There's F1. We just saw LVMH get involved in F1 as well. I mean, again, too many to name, and I'm also probably forgetting several. You can name check me on it, but all that said and done, like how has the influence of sports or sporting events in particular shaped FLB fashion, lifestyle, and beauty strategies for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I don't know where to start, but I mean, maybe speaking about the first thing you mentioned, that Super Bowl with Rihanna, like because that was one of the I think that was speaking about the sportswear theme, that was such an important moment for Salomon because she was wearing a pair of like Salomon
Oh yeah,
and
we measured that too.
yeah, yeah, I
Team has
remember.
data. I'm sure they can send it through the chat, but we measured that one and it was
Yeah.
massive as well.
Yeah, and
Crazy.
I think maybe that was one of like the early times that we spoke because we were speaking about like
Exactly.
the Salomon Margiela shoes and that was like the biggest like crystallizing moment for the niche sportswear brand ascendancy because who would have thought in a million years that Rihanna would be on stage in the Super Bowl wearing a pair of Salomons, which a few years ago were literally nerdy trail running or hiking shoes, and there they were with a Margiela collaboration. Uh,
Exactly.
but yeah, I think it's the kind of like cultural importance of sports that has been turbocharged in the last couple of years has completely changed the game for fashion, beauty and lifestyle businesses. And I speak to so many of them now who have specifically hired people or whole teams when I think about some of the luxury brands to get opportunities in the world of sport, whether that's collaborations or longer term partnerships. And we've seen arenas like Formula One, which has become like a almost a battleground for fashion businesses and beauty businesses.
Yeah,
Uh,
men and women. I mean,
yeah,
there's
women,
Charlotte
yeah,
Tilbury who's sponsored a women's apprenticeship program as well. It's not
yeah,
just I mean, I watch F1 with my husband. It's
yeah,
becoming a thing.
for sure. Yeah, Charlotte Tilbury sponsored the F1 Academy, which is a women's only series, and and then like and beyond that, even in terms of fashion brands across F1, there's been so many in recent years that have entered the space, and now we've seen Adidas for the first time entering Formula One to challenge Puma. We see streetwear brands like Palm Angels in that space. So I think it's fascinating, and at this Super Bowl as well. I think just from what I was reading in the lead up, and is I think it's going to be the highest kind of biggest moment for fashion in the Super Bowl in terms of all the activations and the amount of stuff the NFL specifically is lined up
Well, what
for.
do you know that we don't? We need to maybe talk after so we make sure we're measuring the right things in our roundup because we are going to be measuring the Super Bowl coming up this weekend. Granted, I do pay attention to it, but now I'm kind of like, what's on the plate? So, well, you'll have to let us know. I'm
For
curious
sure.
to know what's in the pipes. But yeah, I mean, the Super Bowl is even last year got even more popular. And I had a question, but now we're talking about the Super Bowl. It's, this weekend is Taylor Swift, of course, now connected, if you will, with Travis Kelce, bringing her star power to it, her celebrity influence, the friends and stuff coming and filling the boxes. How do you feel that celebrity culture is evolving in this sphere? Not necessarily the athlete celebrity, because that's also evolving in its own way, which maybe you have some comments on that, but what do you think its role has been on sports culture and driving also consumer behavior beyond, the sports fans?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been so important, both from like the celebrity aspect and also like the creators around sports. But yeah, I mean, to take the Taylor Swift example, I don't think that we'd have spoken this much about NFL and maybe even the Super Bowl in the last year or so if it wasn't
Yeah.
for that relationship, and kind of the way she's yeah, brought the sport to new audiences. But also I think there's a really interesting conversation around the NFL and sports like Formula One. It's that the female fan bases were always there. They were always engaged, but I don't think the sports and the administrations had ever paid due attention to them because they thought, oh, there's not really an audience. There's not people to like build this around it. Like, why should we? But I mean, I think rightly or wrongly that this moment where, someone like Taylor Swift has come in and shown an interest in the sport and has a vested interest in the sport, they're like, oh, like all this is happening. Oh, more people must be involved. Let's start building out kind of
Completely.
offerings for them.
I
And
mean, yeah, go on.
oh no, I was just going to say, and now, for example, this season we've seen the NFL for the first time ever, I think, release like women's specific apparel and collaborations. They did a collaboration of like formal wear with Veronica Beard. But yeah, it's same thing that's happening in Formula One. I think those fan bases were always there, but now people like Taylor Swift and I'd also point to, I'm not sure if you come across a creator called Morgan Riddle, but she's the partner of a tennis player called Taylor Fritz, an American tennis player, and she's another one who like has done wonders for like diversifying the efforts
Audience.
of
Yeah.
tennis and audience. Just speaking about things like being a female tennis spectator and like taking people behind the scenes at tournaments and really doing tennis federations jobs for them and kind of like in explaining the appeal of the sport to like a broader base of consumers.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I was actually thinking, I mean, with having this session in mind today of the Super Bowl and trying to figure out like before, I mean, being an American, having watched it before at home, the kind of commercials that you would see, let's say pre-2023, this Rihanna moment. And I can't think of there were of course women were watching. We would join, the Super Bowl parties and whatnot. I mean, we're always there and paying attention. But if you think about the type of commercials, it was either like I would say commercials that were addressed to both audiences, like cars or cell phones, things like this. I mean, they're always fun commercials, food commercials, there'd be funny Dorito commercials and all that stuff. But like, if you think of just really female or, you know, um, only ads or directed towards female um, audiences is I couldn't think of anything that came to mind, and I'd be happy to be corrected wrong, except what did stick out was the ELF ads that came out with, oh, I'm forgetting the actress now, that came out in 2024, right after, of course, the success of the 2023 Super Bowl. And there were so many, I feel like, more beauty brands involved all of a sudden that it's just like the ad space, which is obviously, prime time in terms of ad spend for the year, was taking over. Oh, somebody mentioned in the chat Cardi
Cardi
B.
B.
as well. I don't remember that one, but yeah, I mean, there's so many more, I would say, efforts that I think people realized and had a moment where it's like, oh, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And also on that point, I think one thing that we didn't mention was speaking about sportswear and this kind of like sporting moment has been the importance of like the rising like commercial interest, viewership, and investment in women's sports leagues in general.
Yeah.
Just because I think that's also like forced a lot of the sportswear brands to up their game, or the ones who are kind of like already well positioned are kind of like benefiting from it in interesting ways. So like I think Adidas has always done a good job of working with teams like Arsenal, for example, and designing like bespoke collaborations for the women's team rather than just doing like, oh, we're going to do this one big collaboration and the men can wear it and the women can wear it. Like speaking to female athletes, but also female fans, I think is really important as a sportswear brand. And you saw that when Arsenal did the collaboration with Adidas and Stella McCartney. And I think Nike did a good job of it at this most recent Paris Fashion Week and flying over a lot of its most prominent US female athletes into Paris Fashion Week for their first ever Paris Fashion Week and styling them and having them sit front row at shows and also like what we saw just yesterday from Nike where it kind of like rolled out is maybe one of its biggest ever signature sneaker launches for a female athlete in Aja Wilson, the WNBA MVP. And that kind of
I think
level.
you posted about that. I was like, I feel like I saw that.
Yeah,
It was you. Yeah.
yeah,
Follow Daniel if you don't.
yeah.
He's great.
You
You'll
can read
get the
my
first
interview
scoops.
plan.
Yeah, exactly. You'll get the scoops. No, I think that's interesting. And I guess like, well, we're talking about social media, but like social media and influencer culture has obviously should shifted consumer trends. We just heard about that in the beauty session that was just before us. But it's also particularly present in the sportswear space with athletes, you know, celebrities in their own right, celebrities or consumers becoming ambassadors. You have trainers who are influential as well. How do you think social media platforms have or will continue to shape the sportswear trends in 2025? Do you think there's any specific platforms or content types that you think will emerge to engage better with these audiences? Um, Maybe your thoughts on TikTok amongst all this.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think one of the most interesting things I think social media has been really great and transformative for like the way that these athletes are able to market themselves and has really shifted the kind of like bargaining power that they have between the brands and the athlete in the sense that a lot of the time like now especially in the US I think like when a player comes onto the scene turns pro like they've already like at a stage of maturity in terms of their branding and their operation and also their following where they could almost be at a level where the brands that are trying to partner with them they're a bit bigger than them. So that kind of like really shifts the bargaining power and it shifts how a brand needs to approach and the things that they can offer players. And also I think an interesting trend that we're seeing again because of the empowerment that social media has given people in sports, has given teams in sports and athletes especially, um, is the realization that sometimes if the brand deals don't necessarily work for them, they can go it alone. So we're seeing a lot of players kind of like start their own lines, develop their own products, um, or it's a situation where instead of like signing away all their kind of like exclusivity rights to a brand, they'll say like, I want to sign this deal, but I want to carve out the option for footwear because I want to start my own line.
I mean,
And
yeah, if you look back and think at how, you know, Michael Jordan was the first to do what he did and how he did it. And now all the types of deals that are done, I mean, you would know in your new role and what players are doing and what brands are looking for. It's really evolved so much
oh
since
yeah, for
then. I
sure.
mean,
And
it's not the same.
yeah, and that was one thing that we I forgot to mention about On. It was that like one of the most like fundamental aspects of their kind of like growth trajectory was when they instead of paying Roger Federer like millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to be an ambassador, they convinced him to pay them and invest in the company when it was still a little known thing, and it was like this amazing success story of two Swiss
Yeah.
giants, Federer and On, coming together, and that was probably one of the smartest business deals
Win-win.
that
Yeah.
that either of them will ever make.
Yeah. Frankly, that was not a bad move. So I guess on to we spoke about briefly the DTC model and how it works and doesn't work for some brands. But the direct to consumer model has been a major disruptor nonetheless for many industries. Of course, you mentioned during COVID as well, it was like the way to reach the consumer. But brands that came up like Gymshark or Peloton, especially during that time, built really successful brands by going directly through e-commerce and having these, community built brands. Do you think this model is sustainable long term? How do traditional sportswear giants like Adidas or Nike approach it or should approach it? Maybe a balanced approach, if you will, or how do these smaller brands, consider this? Um, what are
Yeah.
the keys to succeeding from a distribution model?
I think at the time when brands like Gymshark um came up, and I'd add Alo Yoga into that too. Like the
Yes.
ETC model was like super favored, and it was kind of like the in vogue thing to do. It was like very fashionable, like, oh, we're and it was this like kind of bold new way to like leverage e-commerce to be like, we don't need all these different stores. We will maximize our margins and have a direct relationship with our consumers and be able to benefit from all the data that comes with that, by selling directly to the consumer. And that cuts overheads because you don't need things like a bunch of stores all around. You don't need
Yeah,
the
it doesn't sound bad on
yeah,
paper. Like I can see why Nike leaned into it, especially during the
100%.
pandemic. Like they had the brand recognition, they had the brand power. People knew the brand. It wasn't like, oh, I wonder if Nike's a good product. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. And I think it still makes sense to an extent, especially if you're a brand with a super strong identity and speaking to a super specific community, in the sense that Gymshark were, when it was kind of one of the first brands to really speak to like people who lived and gym goers. Um, Same with Alo Yoga in terms of that kind of like section of the activewear market. And I would say I do think it's a lot more straightforward as a strategy if you don't if the majority of the products you're selling is not footwear, because I think footwear is unique in that you kind of really need to touch and feel and see the products in real life, to try on, over and over again. But I think after you reach a certain level of maturity and scale as a brand, as we've seen with Gymshark, like Gymshark itself is now slowly started going to select retail partnerships, I think with Selfridges and maybe Harrods and one or two others, even though it's predominantly still a DTC brand. But I do think that that goes to show that, like, as a brand, if you want to reach a certain scale, there's only a certain finite number of people you can reach selling directly through your own platform. And brand leaders always tell me there's no better marketing that you can do for your own brand than showing up in stores. And it's not necessarily even about the name of the store you shop in, it's about what brand you shop next to on the rack.
yeah.
And if your brand is next to another reputable sportswear brand, or across the aisle from a like, the luxury brand section, you're kind of like benefiting from that
The
association.
discoverability as well. And just also, I mean, it's like I was mentioning, you go into the multi-brand stores or specialty, even if it's a specialty sportswear store, like if, you're in the US, like REI Dick's, or if you're, anywhere else here in Europe, like a Decathlon or something, you're going in to browse multiple.
Mhm.
You know what you want? A shoe. You want a shirt, but it's like, which one? Well, I don't know. I'm going to look at price. I'm going to look at feeling. I'm going to look at comfort. I'm going to look at performance, like the actual technical side of it. And I think being considered in amongst options where you might not have been considered otherwise is part of it.
100%.
Yeah. I love that. And so we have some other questions as well that I want to get to, some questions from the audience, because we have I'd say about 5 or 6 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one question first is, how about, what do you think of sportswear, being that it's completely blurred the lines now with everyday fashion? Like, what drove this shift? Where did it start, and where is it heading next, of like sportswear, streetwear? And like I said, the performance shoes now in the streets of Paris or London or New York. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Is it dying? Is it dead? Are people still into it? What are we doing? 2025, are we wearing them?
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, again, we think of like Nike and Adidas and all these brands as like big sports powerhouses that you wear like on court, on pitch, on field, whatever, on track. But like the majority, like the vast majority of their sales come from lifestyle and fashion products. Um, and I think that that is the kind of almost like as important to them in terms of the key to growth than their athletic products. And I think that's one thing that they're both working very hard on at the moment in terms of Nike and Adidas to get right, because for a long time they both relied on product groups in that fashion space that were getting a bit old and stale. So, for example, for Nike, it was the retro basketball chunky high top sneakers like
Yeah.
Jordans or Air Force Ones or even Dunks for on the low top end, which were selling still at super high volumes, but like slower and slower and slower each year. And and Nike got to the point where they've had to kind of like clean up the marketplace and pull back on those and now start filling the marketplace with newer lifestyle models that fit a bit more what consumers want these days. So that's a bit more like low-rise shoes. They're a bit sleeker and you can kind of wear in maybe some like more elevated outfits. And again, moving away from the basketball aesthetic a lot more to like the soccer shoe aesthetic, which Adidas have really got right in recent years with low profile sneakers like the Gazelle, the Samba, and the
Yeah.
Superstar, which is now bringing back. So I think this is the area where, as a sports brand, you really have to get right, and I think that's what On is working on at the moment because On is kind of has the opposite issue in the sense that it as it comes to performance, it's kind of unbeatable. It's the kind of the best product in the market along with a few other brands. But at the same time, it's made some really great strides in recent years, going from like a shoe that was associated with like investment bankers and VC guys over to like, it has a Loewe collaboration. It has a collaboration with like really cool streetwear names like Post Archive Faction from South Korea. And like people are now beginning to wear their shoes on as part of like fashionable outfits and seeing them at Fashion Week and that kind of thing. So that's why they've been investing huge amounts of money in like partnerships with Zendaya or FKA Twigs. And I think that section of the sportswear market is so vital to get right because the fashion side of things really does drive sales
Yeah,
and it keeps
ensuring to make that
marketing.
crossover. Exactly. And I think it's like you said, exploring the new footwear shapes, more the low soled minimalist approach.
Mhm.
And it made me think there was I saw the Bad Bunny ballerina, was it Nike? The ballerina type shoe, which was just super minimal
Oh,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Fantastic. There's one other question from the audience, and then we'll have to do our last wrap-up question. But how important will sustainability be for sportswear brands, and are technologies ready to supply sustainable performance products? It's a really good
That
question.
that's a really good question. I mean, that is the single biggest, probably most important question for these brands who produce like
Exactly.
millions and billions of units of footwear and apparel every single year and
And who love the outdoors, who care
love
about
the
that at the
outdoors.
same time as well.
Yeah. So I mean, there is a lot of money that goes into innovating and understanding how brands in the future can I guess produce less waste or less emissions considering their output and I think that's the reason behind some recent innovations that we've seen from certain brands like On, for example, which is investing in these kind of like what I mentioned before, the kind of guns that spray on shoes onto a mold in about 3 minutes, which
Mm,
produces significantly less energy and waste than the usual footwear design process. But I mean, for me, I think we're still very far away from like a mass market substantive technology or innovation that dramatically reduces the level of emissions and output that the industry creates.
yeah, definitely. I have one other question, but I just want to address someone from the audience who said they missed sessions from earlier today. Will they be recorded by any chance? Yes. So this session and all the other sessions from today will be recorded. If you're signed up, which you are if you're here, you'll receive them direct to your inbox as soon as the recording is uploaded, if you will, into the universe. And so you'll be able to watch these on replay and take notes and everything. So last question for you is, looking ahead, what are your key predictions for sportswear in 2025 and beyond? And what trends or developments do you think will define the next phase for brands, but also consumers alike?
Okay, so I think a year from now we'll be sat here or sat somewhere speaking about how 2025 was a really standout year for Nike and that they went from kind of being hammered each quarter financially to turning things around and like putting amazing momentum and progress both in terms of marketing and products. They'll for sure have new sneakers that will have replaced like Dunks and Jordans as the ones that everyone is wearing on their feet. And I know in the next few months they have some very exciting things coming up. So I'm excited to see what Nike is able to achieve in the next 12 months. One brand we haven't spoken about that much and often gets forgotten by journalists and everyone in the space is Puma, but it's kind of like a
Yeah.
sleep giant that doesn't grow super fast,
They're
but
making moves though. They're
they're
making
making
moves.
moves. And again, speaking about like the motorsports trend in Formula One, Puma has some good sneakers that are like from that area, like the Speed Cat, the Puma Speed Cat, which again, like they're putting a big marketing push behind. And I think that again is another low rise sneaker that is going to have a lot of traction this year. And then again, finally, the final trend is just seeing how brands, more and more sportswear brands gravitate to designing apparel and footwear specifically based off the needs and requirements of female consumers. And instead of like producing replica copies for both men and women, I think those are the three big things that I'll be looking for, three or four big things I'll be looking for this year.
Amazing. Well, I could talk forever, frankly, about this, but I think we're hitting up our time, even if we did get some extra time to start in the beginning. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. It's, like I said, always a pleasure to get your expert eye into the future of sportswear, the growing influence of, the cross between sports and culture, and on FLB, fashion, lifestyle, and beauty, and how it's influencing in that. I really appreciate your time. And then for the audience, if you haven't yet, follow us on socials. Join the conversation by tagging us on #PerformanceSummit at Launchmetrics, and stay tuned for our last session, which is the evolution of influence, how celebrities, cinema, and data-driven culture is and data is driving culture today, pardon. So that's coming up in 5 minutes, and we're going to hear more from, let's say, the West Coast, LA, and all things Hollywood. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.